There we are. Shabbat Shalom. Good morning, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
And I believe, Lynn, I want to double check with you. Are we at Joshua chapter 22?
I thought we were 23, but somewhere in there.
Okay.
We're about to start 23.
Did we start 23? Okay, we'll quickly review 22. But first, we will do the blessing. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with the words of Torah. The tribes that are on the east side of the Jordan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, put up some figures to pray to, and that got the other tribes very upset. And so we see a framing in the conquest of an initial apostasy by this one guy, remember, who didn't do what he was supposed to do, and then there was a community punishment for it. And here we have a bunch of tribes doing something they're not supposed to do. So there's always the risk of either enemies, true enemies that are going to challenge the Israelites, as well as internal, in a sense, enemies, because the tribes can fight with each other. And there's always a temptation to go it alone, to build an altar to another god. For example, if they built an altar of great size, and so then there's a war against those tribes. And Pinhas, if you remember, he's pretty much of a fanatic. He's the one who skewered the Israelite who was having sex in the temple with a forbidden woman. And he sent with the chiefs of all the different tribes. And they say, what is this treachery that you've committed against the God of Israel and turning away today from God by building an altar? And, we already had sins in the past, and God's going to get really angry. And actually the altar 26 is their altar where they are now repenting to say, yeah, we won't ever do this again. So then peace is made. Okay, so we'll go to chapter 22, or 23, I'm sorry. And the last two chapters of the book of Joshua are basically exhortations by Joshua, a little bit like Moses on his final, in his final breath, giving advice and direction to the tribes. Now it's up to Joshua to do that. So does somebody want to read chapter 23?
I can do that.
Thank you.
Okay. A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies, all around. Can you make it any bigger?
You can make it bigger actually on your screen. Let me see if I can. There is a place where it says view and you can make it bigger, but I don't.
All right, no, I'm okay.
Let me see maybe if I squish it, it'll make is that better?
It's the same. A long time afterward, when the Lord, now it's better. When the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies all around, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel, their elders and heads, their judges and officers, and said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. I have allotted to you an inheritance for your tribes, whose nations that remain, along with all the nations that I've already cut off from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore, be very steadfast to observe and do all that is written in the book of law of the, my voice is not doing, book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right nor to the left, so that you may not be mixed with these nations left here among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow yourself down to them. But hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no one has been able to withstand you to this day. One of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you as he promised you. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and join the survivors of these nations here among you, intermarry with them, so that you marry their women and they yours, know assuredly that the Lord your God will not continue to drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a scourge on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land that the Lord your God has given you. Boy, threats and threats and threats.
Yep.
Let somebody else read. My voice is doing weird things.
Okay, the last few verses from this chapter.
I can do it.
Thank you.
And now I am about to go the way of all the earth. And you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one thing has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one of them has failed. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the bad things until he has destroyed you from this good land that the Lord your God has given you. If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he enjoined on you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land that he has given you.
Okay. So.
Haven't they learned anything yet?
Apparently they need to hear the same thing over and over and over again. So here are the highlights of this chapter. So again, reminding the Israelites that there are these enemy nations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that God is driving them out for you. Covenant obedience is absolutely essential. There's a promise of God's future help, assuming that you're all going to be loyal and not go after other gods. There is a prohibition against intermarriage. This is one of those, chapters that you don't want to share so readily with people who are converting to Judaism or people who are intermarried, because it's like, ooh. Unfortunately, there are a number of places in the Torah where it says do not intermarry. On the other hand, don't forget Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, our forefathers, all married non-Israelites.
So did David.
So did Solomon, but we saw what happened with Solomon, right?
Right.
And Ezra, which we'll never get to because that's like way at the end of the Bible. But Ezra comes back from exile in Babylonia in the 5th century BCE and discovers that the Israelites who were left behind have been intermarrying, and he, decrees that they have to divorce all these women. And it's not clear that they ever do, by the way. He does tell them to, but it's not clear that they ever do. So that's a little bit of a loophole there. Maybe they didn't. There's obviously dire consequences to apostasy. Apostasy being, not being loyal to God and going after other gods or another religion. And we see over and over again the consequences of not being loyal to God. Now, even though they've conquered the land, there are still enemies in the land, right? Specifically on the western part of the land where the Philistines are. They're the major enemy, which is why eventually they're going to need a king to fight the Philistines. And temptation lurks always. There's always the possibility that you can be drawn to all these other rituals and gods and whatever. And we will see throughout the whole historical section, which is what this is, that Israel as the people will constantly be drawn to other gods, and constantly be punished, and the punishment is usually another nation coming and beating them up, which God says is God sending them. The exile, God's power is proven here, because here they are, and they've left, they've come back. God's made it possible for them to come back. But the reason they were exiled in the first place, and could be exiled again, is if they are not loyal. And in the wilderness, God sustained the Israelites. God can take care of them. It's very clear from that. 40 years in the desert, they had manna. Nothing terrible happened to them. And so Joshua would like them to think about that period, and that maybe those memories will enable them to cling to God. So that is that first speech. Any comments, questions, or whatever? The next one being the final chapter, but also really important, because it's the Covenant Renewal, and it sets the stage for the next book. Okay, so let's go on to the next. Okay, who would like to read this? I'll try to see if I can make it a little bit bigger. I think that makes sense.
I can read.
Okay, thank you, Doug.
Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors, Terah and his sons, Abraham and Nahar, lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan, and then made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country to Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in its midst, and afterwards I brought you out. When I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your ancestors with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. When they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come upon them and cover them, and your eyes saw what I did to Egypt. Afterwards, you lived in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I handed them over to you, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then King Balak, son of Zippor of Moab, set out to fight against Israel. He sent and invited Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam. Therefore he blessed you, so I rescued you out of his hand. When you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I handed them over to you. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove out before you the two kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, the towns that you had not built, and you live in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive yards that you did not plant."
Okay, I'm going to stop you there for just a moment. So this is the Covenant Renewal, and the way it is organized and structured, it's sort of like the book of Deuteronomy, and both of them are based on the suzerain covenants between the suzerain, the prince or whoever is in charge of the land, and the people that are under them. And so what the leader will say is he'll start off by giving a historical overview of everything that he's done for the people. So here we have a very quick review. If you look at the book of Deuteronomy, you'll see that Moses does the same thing, although it's quite a bit longer. This is like a very encapsulated history of of what God has done for Israel, right? From Abraham all the way to Joshua, right? starting with Abraham and the various other patriarchs, the release from slavery in Egypt, the opening up of the Red Sea, the destruction of the Egyptian army, the wilderness, and then the conquest, where all these people are driven out, or of course, Balak and Balaam in between, driving out these 7 nations. And so this is a history to remind people of, hey, good idea to stick with me because I have taken care of you. Look at all these wonderful things I've done for you. So at the very least, you should be grateful. And then the next part is going to be the stipulations of the covenant. So if you'd like to continue, Doug.
Rabbi Singer,
yes.
What's with the hornet?
It sounds like those killer bees that were here for a while, right? Let's see, there's a little note for this. Let's see what it says. Meaning of Hebrew uncertain. Okay. I don't know what the hornet, you know what? Let me just look and see if there's a note in the altar book, unless you have it right there, Jane.
Let me take a look.
I mean, I've got it here. So, okay, let's see.
In the Jewish Study Bible, it says plague, sometimes translated as plague.
So it could be, yeah, he doesn't have a note on that, I don't think. It's verse 13. Let me see. Here, yeah. The hornet. This is the traditional understanding of Sri'ah, leading some scholars to claim that noxious insects were actually used as weapons. But on etymological grounds, as I proposed it, the term could mean the smasher, a mythological rather than a zoological entity. So they don't know what it is. It could be some special weapon. It could be a bunch of, killer bees. It could be a plague. We don't know for sure. But Alter thinks that hornet is the proper translation, as does, this is the New Revised Standard Version. So we don't know. So thank you for pointing that out, because that makes it clear that we don't know what it is. Yeah, go ahead. Sandy, anything else?
No, thanks.
All right, Doug.
All right. Now, therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. When the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods, for it is the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight. He protected us along all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God.
So, all right, here we've got the stipulations about what you're supposed to do. But hey, you got a choice. You can go ahead and serve the other gods. P.S. I just told you what'll happen if you do that. But okay, that's your choice, right? Or you can serve our God, okay? And they say, yes, we will definitely do this. Just like they did when, Moses brought the Torah and said, will you accept this Torah? Yes, we will do and we will hear, which is opposite to what it should be. Mm-hmm. Because it should be, we will hear and we will do. Like, we'll first hear what it is or understand it, and then we'll do it. But if they say they're going to do it first, and then they'll figure out what it means. Did you have a question, Sandy?
Yeah, is this an example of free will?
Well, it's a kind of strange free will, because if you accept this covenant, it'll be great. If not, you're going to be punished. So go ahead and make your choice. Hell of a choice, huh? Which, the Midrash is that, one of the Midrashes is that God is holding the mountain over the people's head when they're getting the Torah. And if they accept it, all will be well. If they don't, they get the mountain dropped on their heads. So it doesn't sound like complete free will. I mean, you have the free will not to do it, but then horrible things are going to happen to you. So I don't know. Do you think that's free will? Probably
in
not.
a way. In a way.
Okay. Yeah, you're free to be punished. Okay, go ahead, Doug.
Yep. But Joshua said to the people, you cannot serve the Lord, for you cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, and he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. And the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. He said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. The people said to Joshua, the Lord our God, we will serve, and him we will obey.
Okay,
so Joshua made a covenant.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to point out that so we went through the historical overview, then we went through the stipulations of what the covenant's about, and now we've got the witnesses. So the people are witnesses pretty much kind of against themselves. And we also have the curses and blessings around what it is that you are going to be involved with. Jenny, yes.
So in 19, when Joshua says you will not be able to serve the Lord, I guess I'm confused about that. So on one hand, the Israelites are being given this sort of ambiguous choice. Is it really a choice? And then Joshua follows up by saying, you will not be able to serve the Lord.
Right. So it is a disturbing line. Thank you for pointing that out. What Joshua is doing here is, I don't think this is a great translation. I think it's more you won't be able to, as opposed to you can't. In other words, cannot serve the Lord, you could even take as, okay, I just gave you this great deal, but you can't do it. But what he's doing is he's expressing doubt. God is a jealous God, and he's not going to forgive your transgressions. And you are going to transgress, and you're not going to stay faithful. It's an unfortunate statement at the end of his life, at the end of this covenant renewal ceremony. But he's basically expressing his doubt that you'll be able to follow through on this. And what Alter says, in the face of the people's solemn declaration to remain faithful to the God of Israel, Joshua expresses grave doubt. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is a holy God making severe demands of exclusive loyalty, and I don't believe he'll be able to meet these demands. This view sets the stage for the series of idolatrous backslidings in Judges. So, he's not saying, oh, I trust you, you're a good people. He's saying, I don't trust you, which is, in a sense, this whole book is disturbing in so many different ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Rabbi, has this group talked about this translation of he's a jealous God?
I was going to get back to that. Yeah, I was going to get back to that after Doug finished reading, but we can talk about it right now. Yeah, God is a jealous God. God is holy and jealous. Jealous in the sense that if you start going after other gods, that's not acceptable. I'm not going to forgive you for that. Is there something else you want to say about that?
So is jealous the right word though? I mean, God is a demanding God. Other gods are not jealous of other gods. Why is this God so jealous? I mean, you don't see in the Mesopotamian pantheon, you don't see the gods jealous of other gods. You do in the Greek and the Roman. But I mean, it sounds so odd to me. I've always had trouble with that line, always.
I'm going to look at the Hebrew here. What verse is it again? Oh, here it is, 19. Yeah, all right, let me see what the Hebrew, I'm pretty sure that's
19.
Okay. Are you Omer? Wait a minute. No. Yeah, and in the Hebrew basically says, "Vayomer Yehoshua el ha'am," and Joshua said to the people, "Lo tuchlu la'avod et Adonai." It says you won't be able to. It's just straightforward like that. It's nothing, there's no interpretive, move here to say something different from what it says in the Hebrew. He Elohim Kedoshim hu, because God is holy. El Kano hu. Jealous. Let's see how the Orthodox translate that. Jealous. Let's see what they say about it, if they do. Okay, this is just from 19 to 20. They say, sensing from their previous response that they were ready to serve God because they looked forward to blessings and prosperity, just as God had been so benevolent with them in the past, Joshua warned them that such resolve was doomed to fail. It's not even a doubt. It's like, I know this is not going to work. This is really, very cynical. If all they wanted was blessing and safety from harm, they would surely drift away from God if they were tempted by some other promise of success. Like one of the things is that, the land of Israel is very dry, right? And you have to count on rain to fertilize your fields. Well, guess what? Egypt has the Nile and you don't have to worry about that. So maybe the Egyptian gods are better, the fertility gods of Canaan or the rain god of Canaan. Right? It's going to be very tempting to want to go elsewhere. Now, Joshua warned them that God would never tolerate or forgive, especially if they were to spurn him after he had done so much for them. But the word in Hebrew is jealous. Now, let's remember that this was written by human beings who are writing this presumably, or at least it's, from the perspective of exile.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how do they understand that? And they could, at the time, since there were all these other gods around, they could say, well, our God got defeated, and therefore we were driven out of the land of Canaan. Or they could say, our God is the most powerful God, because remember, we didn't go directly from polytheism to monotheism. We theoretically went through monolatry, which means that we know there are other gods, but ours is the strongest and the best. So there are other gods out there. Ours is the strongest. Ours could not be defeated by other gods. Therefore, it must be that we did something wrong and we were punished. And so that's how they understand it. We could interpret, what's befallen the Israelites in a very different way. We could say, well, maybe they weren't strong enough militarily, or maybe they put too much money into luxury rather than into defense, or whatever it is, right? But since they're religious people, they interpret this to mean that God was punishing them out of jealousy. Well, they're ascribing to God human emotions.
Yeah.
Because that's the only language we really have, right? We don't know how to explain God in anything other than our own human terms. So we say God is jealous, but that's our take on God's behavior. But
but we're not supposed to be jealous of other people. Like we're not supposed to covet our neighbor's wife or his cow or his house or anything like that. And here's God jealous if we stray or we go to some other God. It just doesn't make sense to me. God's supposed to be perfect, and God is very imperfect.
Oh, yeah. Well, listen, what was the reason given by Moses for why God should not destroy the people after the golden calf?
Because the other gods would make fun of him and laugh at him.
But not just the other gods, but the other peoples would say, wait a minute.
Yeah.
He spent all this time trying to help these guys, and now he's destroying them. Who is this guy? And God was worried about God's reputation. Yeah. Is that the kind, so a couple of people, so Victoria says, I heard jealous. Wait, it just moved now. I heard jealous is actually zealous. Well, that's a gentle way of putting it, but the word in Hebrew is jealous. Okay. And Suzanne says, is this a characteristic of monotheism? If there's only one God, the one God should abhor worship of any other God. Okay, so again, this is a scholarly theory that we started with polytheism. There are a bunch of different gods, right? Yahweh was probably the local god, right? Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, it was the local god that eventually became our God. And so there continues to be an understanding that there are other gods until Isaiah. Isaiah says there is only one God. But before that, we have things like the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before you. Wait a minute, I thought there were no other gods.
What happens to the other gods then?
Well,
Disappear?
okay.
They roll over and died.
Okay, so let me give you the trajectory here. So you have in the 10 Commandments, you shall not worship other gods or have other gods before you. Well, that's a little confusing because who are these other gods? What do you mean? There's only one, right? Okay, and then you have the Michamocha, which actually comes before that, where we say, who is like you among the gods? Now, a lot of times that gets translated differently because it's a very disturbing thing. What do you mean, who's like you among the gods? There aren't any other gods. So sometimes it gets translated into like the celestial beings or something like that, kind of fudging the words. But the scholarly understanding is that we believed in many gods. Then we believed that our God was superior, but the other gods exist. And eventually we say, oh, all those other gods are not gods. Those are fantasies. There is only one God, but it's a kind of continuum there. So the idea of jealousy is because there is a belief that there are other gods out there. They're just not the gods we should be worshiping. And even in monolatry, though, it's a problem to go to worship a different God. In this case, jealousy is more a matter of violation of monogamy. Yeah, in some ways, you're right. It is kind of, actually, if you get to the prophet Hosea, in fact, I just read something from another rabbi saying she doesn't want to teach this anymore. Because Hosea talks about the Israelites as being the bride of God. And what did we do? We committed adultery by going after other gods. And then there's some very violent sexual language about, how God is going to punish this, wanton woman. And it's a really disturbing, image of male versus female. And I can understand why somebody wouldn't want to read it, especially if you're teaching it to anybody who's fairly young. So, yeah, but again, jealousy, that's how we understand God. It's not that God is that way necessarily, right? We don't know. Is God really capable of jealousy? Is God capable of anger? Listen, there's all this language of God is incredibly angry. This is supposed to be this very compassionate God. What do we say at the high holidays? The 13 attributes of God: God forgiving and compassionate and loving. And they also slice off the end of that verse, by the way, in the liturgy, because the end of the verse is visiting the sins of the father unto the fourth generation, right? And they slice that off. So when we read it, we don't hear that ending. Actually, in Isaiah says that God creates light and darkness, good and evil. The Isaiah verse is actually in the Yotzer Or, which is the creation blessing in the morning, not the evening. So basically what it says, creator of light and darkness, who makes peace and fashions all things. So it's changed from who creates good and evil, because that is too disturbing to have to say every day. We don't want to say those things out loud, but that's in the Bible. God creates light and darkness, good and I can't remember now. But anyway, so we fudge it when we have to actually use this material for something like liturgy. But did our God create the other gods? Well, there are no other gods eventually. So
but in the act of creation, did God create? If God created everything, then he had to have created the other gods.
That's even an interesting discussion that goes, from a historical context, there's always the Danube River and what the Danube River represented in Europe. And for so long, south of the Danube River you had the Celtic tribes, and north of the Danube River, you had the Germanic tribes, and you had the Slavic tribes that were pushing in. And there's always this discussion point. And if you look at a lot of the archaeology from the section, what is now the Czech Republic and Austria, and as the world kind of comes together, southern Germany, you find these overlays that wind up happening. And some of the questions are, did the Celtic gods wind up conquering the Germanic gods? And did the Slavic gods wind up conquering? And there's always these very interesting mixtures until you get to Hallstatt, which is in Austria, which was the very center of the Celtic world for a very long time before they were pushed westwardly. And when you look at the archaeological traditions in Hallstatt, what you see is that it all merged together. The Germanic gods and the Celtic gods and some of the different elements and some of the different concepts, until there was kind of like, well, yeah, but this one's the main one. And the question that came up that the archaeologists have asked is, I wonder if they thought that one created all the other ones. And that's such an interesting question, because that question has come up over and over again as you see these cultural overlays in Europe. And I've often viewed Israel and the various groups that have moved across that section of our world and what has happened in Central Europe in so many ways, because again, it's different cultures, it's different languages, it's different traditions. Sometimes you actually look at things, and then later when you put Christianity over the Celtic, that's where you get all sorts of bizarre things start popping up, because they start having to have matriarchal traditions moving in, and suddenly the Virgin Mary pops up, and the Virgin Mary's emphasis within female dominant previous religious traditions. But all of them have this concept of, but did one God wind up making all the other gods? Because it makes sense when you have references to a whole bunch of other gods. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
Jenny is saying reference to other gods is what people believe, not an endorsement of the existence of other gods. Absolutely. This is to help transition people to the concept of one God. Well, I don't think it was a purposeful transition. It's just, according to scholars, how it developed, that it's really hard to go from polytheism to monotheism in one fell swoop. So it sort of evolved this way. And you know, I don't think it was a purposeful evolution. I think it's just how things evolved, at least according to scholars. I can't vouch for it being the correct theory because we weren't there, we don't know, and we don't really know God. But I think the idea here is that the other gods aren't real gods, even though people believe they are real gods. So remember the whole story of Abraham with the idol shop, right? His father has an idol shop and all that, and he destroys the idols, and his father says, what happened? And he says they were all they fought each other for the food that was here. And his father says, but how can they do that? It's wood and stone. And Abraham says, exactly. So it's not that there's an acknowledgement that the other gods are real, it's that people believe they are real, and that is the kind of environment in which the Israelites are living. And they're considered false gods, right? But yeah, people believe that. It's not an endorsement of other gods by any means. But the fact is that probably there wasn't an understanding at that time of only one God in the universe. It probably is that people thought there were other gods, and the Israelites probably thought the same thing. So yeah.
I still believe that. I mean, there's Hindus and Buddhists and Muhammad and in the tribes in South America, everybody seems to have their own guy.
Well, you know, what Judaism would say is that, you know, they're not the real gods, but I don't think, at least in a biblical perspective, that they would care that much what other people are worshiping, as long as the Israelites stay away from them. And I know you're trying to apply logic to this, but it's not necessarily all logical. It's more organic in a sense, right? You just believe in many gods, and eventually one day you go, no, there's only one. So I think you have to be just a little bit careful about taking any of this too literally, in the sense that it's not as though we're saying God is jealous. That is how these people understood God. And let's not forget that this is Joshua talking about God to the people, trying to get them to be faithful to God. So maybe he's saying God is jealous, and maybe God isn't jealous. Maybe God is just really cool. But we know that that's not the case, because anytime these people go after other gods, they get severely punished. Now, maybe that's not out of jealousy. Maybe it's out of something else. But, you know, Joshua's trying to argue this point. Okay, there's a new message. Let's see what that is. Muhammad is definitely not a god, right? They would say they worship our God, but not our God. Right.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to that, but I did.
Yeah. Muhammad is the prophet, and Allah is theoretically the same God. I mean, that you know, we're all in the Abrahamic tradition worshiping the same God. We just refer to that God slightly differently. In Christianity, there's a Trinity. Allah is the God in Islam, and we call our God Yud He Vav He. It's all pretty much the same God. We have different ways of worshiping that same God. But, you know, there are other traditions that either don't believe in God at all, like Buddhism, or traditions that believe in multiple gods. And as I said, I don't think this God that we're actually right here talking about cares what's happening in India, unless those Indians move to Canaan and start tempting our people, right? I mean, this is great because, you know, we're all trying to say, well, wait a minute, if there are other gods, did our God create those gods? Well, I would think that the argument would be, no, people created those other gods because they're not real gods. And then people would say, we created this God too, right? Because do we know that there's really God there? You have to have faith, but aside from that.
Isn't it just all part of the same syndrome? I mean, the argument that this is what people believe, I mean, you can just turn that on its head and say, you know, this particular aspect of God, a deity, which is Yahweh, is what we believe.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah, we believe that. And are we believing something that actually exists, or are we just making it up? So I read a book a few years ago by a woman who's a reporter for NPR, and she went through a whole thing about that somehow there's something in us that apprehends God that's really based on the fact that there is a God, that our connection to this is real. But it's not something you can argue logically, which is why faith is faith. It's not based on logic, right? It's not a proof of God's existence. You have to experience God, right? Any other comments before we? Yes, Jason.
Well, there are a couple things that stood out to me. As the conversations bounced around. My first thought was about Joshua. The way he was speaking to the Israelites felt to me like he was talking to them like they were children, right? The way you might say, oh, well, I thought you were a big boy, but I guess you're not. So you don't really deserve this. So I'm not going to be able to do it. And then you make them go, no, I'll be good. I can do it. and then you say, okay, you can have this thing after all. I guess you're responsible enough. And then I was thinking about the word jealous, and it just struck me as that this is one of these attempts to anthropomorphize, right? Mm-hmm. If we're supposed to walk in God's ways, we have to be able to define them in ways that we can respond or behave. So understanding that God is capable of jealousy is a reflection of the fact that we're capable of jealousy, and it gives us something to work on, right? I feel like we have to keep defining God in these terms, because we can't define God in any terms that we can't. There is no definition of God, right? But we keep trying to use these types of words. So we talk about compassionate God and, you know, generous God and all the and blessing and all these things, so that they're things that we can somehow do something with, right? Like we can understand the concept of jealousy. We can't understand the concept of God, right? I guess that's sort of how I
agree.
Come around.
I completely agree with that, and I think that's a great insight. The thing about Joshua saying, I know you can't do this. It's a way to challenge people to the point where they're saying, yes, we can, right? That's a good insight, a parental, coming from a parent. Yes, I think that's a good insight.
And sort of the big general thing that we were getting to at the end is, you know, I've always thought there's something that's sort of perverse about the idea that every religion that says it's the right religion, that would mean that all the other ones are wrong. And I always thought there was something wrong with a society, with just a planet full of people thinking almost everyone else was wrong. or that any one true God would want most of the planet to be wrong. And so I've always taken it the reverse way and said, they're all right, and they're all getting to the same place. They just call it different things. And that's just been my way of sort of trying to think of religion, not as something that divides us, but that we have in common. It's a seeking that everybody has framed differently based on their own cultural histories. But I can't believe that it's possible, as I've certainly been told by people, no, they're all wrong, we're right. Like, I can't accept that, because that means that God's condemning, the mass of humanity to some sort of, eternal whatever, right? I mean, like, I can't wrap my head around the idea of a God that would do that to so many people for all these years.
Absolutely, I agree with you totally. And all these religious wars that we have experienced in history are human beings pushing the concept that I'm the only one who's right. And we certainly see that in our country today, right? Suzanne.
What do you think is the deal with Joshua making the people witnesses against themselves?
What do I think?
I mean, he's specifically telling them, like, condemn yourselves by making yourself witnesses against yourselves.
Maybe, I don't know. What do you think, Jason? That it's a little bit like that statement of, you can't do this. It's like, you're going to have to, be your own witness, because that's a really powerful way to keep you accountable. But what do you think? Is that another parental move?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, who else can be their witness? They're there in assembly, and they're each other's witnesses. It's like, you're swearing to your brother and your sister. I mean, I don't know. I took it sort of literally, like there's no one else there. It's not like you're in a court and you're,
in Deuteronomy, let me give you a couple of other examples though. In Deuteronomy, do you remember who the witnesses were? When Moses does the same thing with them, although it takes a full book, not just one chapter. It's the sky and the earth. Those were the witnesses, which kind of is that called a merism, where it's used to mean everything in between as well. And then, the other example has just escaped me. Wait a minute, I had another example, but if somebody wants to express their view on this while I'm trying to remember.
Well, I guess I would say God doesn't need to witness in a formal way, because we can, if you believe these other things, you believe God already knows. So you don't even have to say the words out loud. You don't have to say, I swear. I mean, God knows or doesn't know what's in your heart, right? But saying it out loud to someone else is actually something of a stronger affirmation.
Right. And also, as you said, just having people witness in the community for each other, the idea that the community is responsible for the behavior of the individual members. But I was just also thinking about the Untitled Chapter. And the Untitled Chapter, which is that very scary prayer that we say over the high holidays, we say God is judge, jury, defense attorney, prosecutor, and witness. That's really scary.
An executor.
An executor, executioner, right?
Yeah, right.
So at least here it's just the people, as opposed to, God being everything. But yeah, it's, I think all of these different elements that you've all pointed out are ways in which to reinforce how serious this is, that you can't muck around with this.
Well, Rabbi, if we're made in the image of God, does it mean that God is not perfect?
That's an excellent, excellent question. Excellent. What do people think?
I don't think God is perfect. I see God, we've had this discussion before. I see he in relationship with various peoples, and it is always an evolving relationship. And on a personal level, it's an evolving relationship. That's probably more me than God, but I don't see this fully rounded, complete entity. God makes too many mistakes. God gets too angry. God admits he made the mistake when he destroyed the world. He said, I'll never do it again.
Right.
That's perfection right there. And all you need is one example.
Right. And remember the story in the Talmud of one of the rabbis going into the ruins of the temple and seeing God there. And God says, give me a blessing to the person, right? God is asking a human being to give God a blessing. And the rabbi says, well, what blessing do you want? And God says, may my compassion overrule my anger. There's an imperfect God right there. And certainly the mystics of the tradition believe that our behavior has an effect on God, that God's perfection depends on our perfection.
Right.
And the more out of whack the world is, the more out of whack God is. So there's a direct relationship between us. And the other thing is, if you think about the whole problem of theodicy, theodicy is the reality of evil in the world with the assumption that God is all good and all powerful. How do you explain evil? So Rabbi Harold Kushner, in not why bad things happen to good people, but when bad things happen to good people, because they happen all the time, says, well, there's a problem with that equation. If God is all good and all powerful, you can't explain evil because, yeah, there's punishment, but there's also, random acts of evil and undeserved evil and innocent people suffering. So he says you have to get rid of one part of that equation. Well, if you get rid of God being all good, then what's the point of God? So you have to really get rid of God as all powerful. And God can only do so much. So that's another aspect of God not being perfect, because if God were perfect, how could God not also be all powerful, right? For Maimonides, God is perfect. And there's no change in God ever. And Maimonides would certainly look at all this as anthropomorphized understanding of God. In other words, we're trying to talk about God with human characteristics, which are not accurate, but that's as Jason said, that's the only way we are able to talk about God. How else do you talk about God? I mean, we can't understand it in any other way because that's our language and that's our limitation. It's limited thinking is what it is. So this is, it's very disturbing, but it's a little bit less disturbing if you think of it as human beings trying to understand what is going on here. This is not a report. It's not like a reporter reporting on what is real, right? Because God is mysterious. We try to understand God, but even the mystics say that there's part of God that we will never, ever, ever apprehend. That's the Ein Sof, the without end. And then there are the Sfirot, which are the manifestations of God. Even many of those we can't even apprehend. So it's our best guess. It's the closest we can come. Okay, so let's I mean, I'm happy to talk more about this if you'd like, but we can finish this book very soon, which is amazing. By the way, let's see, it says here, I want to point this out as well. Okay, so Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. And that's very important because Abraham purchased a plot or built an altar there. Sorry, he built an altar there and Jacob purchased a parcel of ground there. So this is an important city, which, by the way, do you know what Shechem is today? Anybody know? Ramallah. It's in the West Bank. Anyway, so Abraham had built an altar there. Jacob had purchased a plot, a parcel of ground there. So there's the association with our patriarchs from using that particular city. And the other thing is the resonance there is that Jacob had to purchase this little plot of land, but now we no longer have to worry about purchasing because we've taken it over. Now it's ours, the promised land. Yeah. Let's see, let me go back to this text. Now we have the fact that Jacob went down to Egypt, right? Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. He, of course, was not tempted to worship the gods of rain and fertility because he was a good guy. But this is a warning again against the temptation, because again, Israel being a land dependent on rain, and sometimes it doesn't rain, just like in California, you might be tempted to worship the god of rain. Please let it rain. And that's one of those huge temptations. And Joshua expresses grave doubt that you people will be able to do this, right? You're so flawed and you're so prone to slipping away from what you're supposed to do that I really don't know if this is going to work. And it may be a technique to get them to be even more willing to be loyal to God. Like, I'm going to prove you wrong, Dad, right? Okay.
But on the other hand, Rabbi, why don't the people say back to him, but look at all the things we have accomplished? Instead of emphasizing the negative, why don't you emphasize the positive? We got here. We are here.
We got here
victorious.
We got here because
I would be really insulted if Joshua said to me, "Oh, Philly on you." That's what he's saying.
All right, don't forget that as soon as, they leave Egypt, thanks to God helping them get out, right? And who did all these great miracles, as we say in the Michamocha, right? Who's like you, doing these amazing things for us. What did they do shortly thereafter? After they got the Torah, what did they do? Or actually, while Moses was up there getting the Torah for them,
right?
They worshiped the golden calf. That's the first thing they did. Yeah. Okay, this is right after they saw the miracles. Right after they saw the mountain smoking and doing all this stuff. That wasn't enough to keep them loyal to God. And what happens in the desert? What do they do in the desert? They complain nonstop over and, we had such good food in Egypt. Now all we have is this boring manna. Remember all the melons we had and the, the flesh pots and the this and the that, right? Cucumbers. We were so well fed as slaves. We had such a good life. Look what you've done to us now. Why don't you just kill us now? Right? They're not proving that they can be loyal to God, right? And again, the framing.
I give up.
And let me just remind you. I was just going to say the framing of this whole story is the apostasy of the one guy on one side of the story and these 2.5 tribes on the other side. Go ahead, Jason.
No, I find it, I don't know if catch-22 is the right word, but when they come out of Egypt, it's told that none of you who were slaves can be the ones to go into the promised land. They have to wait the whole generation.
Yeah.
And then the generation gets there and they said, remember all the things God did for you? No, you weren't there. All the people who were there are gone. So,
that's the other thing, is that aside from the golden calf and the manna and the complaining, they were supposed to go check out the land, and they came back and said, no way, even though God said, I'm gonna make it happen, right? They said, we are grasshoppers. They're giants. It's constant. But, which is normal, right? Of course they're afraid. And they were just slaves a few minutes ago. You don't go from slavery to freedom, in one fell swoop. And even if you have 40 years in the desert to think about it, things get very frightening out there. So, Joshua has reason to say what he says. It's not necessarily the most beautiful approach. But then again, God's approach has been to say, here, let me list you all the curses that are going to happen if you don't listen to me. You're going to eat your afterbirth, right? Among other charming things you're going to have all kinds of illnesses and plagues. And then you get to the book of Job, and this poor guy has done absolutely everything he was supposed to do, and he still gets all the curses. Why? Because God makes a bet with an angel. Let's see what happens to him if we do all this awful stuff to him. Not only take away everything he has, kill his children, and make his body be, an enemy to him. And then his reward at the end is to get everything back, including a new batch of children. But what about the dead ones? So Joshua, speaking of being created in God's image, that's a pretty good imitation of God that Joshua's doing here. not to be blasphemous about it, but okay. So let's just finish off. I can't believe we're actually finishing another book. All right, let's go down to here. Okay. I think we're at 16, is that right, or 19? I can't remember.
We were definitely past 19 because we were just debating all of that. It was somewhere in the middle of that.
Right.
Oh, no, we're down, we're further down. We're down here at 29.
Okay, so we're at 29?
Yeah.
Okay. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun and servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. They buried him in his own inheritance at Timnath-serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gosh. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had done all the work that the Lord did for Israel. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the portion of the ground that Jacob had bought from the children of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. Eleazar, son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, the town of his son Phinehas, which had been given him in the hill country of Ephraim.
Okay, so Joseph, remember, Joseph wants to be buried in the promised land. So they take his bones and they actually, you know, because of his faith and his goodness and everything, he gets to be buried in the promised land. And Joshua lives to be 110. Why is that significant? What's the ideal number of years?
Less than Moses' 120.
That's right. Exactly. Moses lived to be 120. And Joshua lives to be 110. So close second, but not, no cigar, you know, not quite it. But he is called the servant of God. Let me see if that's in the English. Wait a minute. Yeah, it says the servant of God, which was how Moses was characterized. Remember in the beginning, it said Moses was a servant of God and Joshua was sort of an official or whatever, but he was never called servant of God. Let's see if I can find the word that's used for him. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but oh, he's like an official, yeah. Like Moses is his son and Joshua is the moon in the Talmud. So, but at his death, he becomes an actual servant of God, which is kind of a, you know, honorary title. Closest thing you can get to God is being a servant as opposed to just an official. So that's the end of the book of Joshua. Now, when you finish a book of the Torah, there's a little thing you say. I don't know if you do the same thing for the rest of the Bible, but we'll say it anyway. So you can just repeat after me. Chazak.
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 V'nit chazek.
V'nit chazek.
Which means strength, we will be strengthened. So strengthened by the power of the Bible. So before we, you know, we're going to embark on the Judges and talk about that a little bit. But before we do that, let's just, any closing thoughts about the book of Joshua? How has it struck you, this book?
Lots of do's and don'ts.
A lot of do's and don'ts, yeah.
Too many wars.
Too many wars, a lot of wars, a lot of, you know, conquest. And by the way, what do we do when we conquer a land? I mean, what's the wipe everybody out? Now, it did say somewhere in what we read that, you know, we have vineyards and all kinds of agricultural products that we can enjoy. And that's because, remember, there's certain towns and villages that were not destroyed and were specifically left there by God's command to feed us. You know, we don't just come into the land and have nothing, you know, no food or anything. That's being provided by all those villages and towns that were not destroyed, but there were some that were completely destroyed, right? And we're not allowed to take any of the booty. So does this leave you feeling like, hey, this is really encouraging, or does it leave you feeling disturbed? Where are we at the end of this book?
I'm not crazy about it. I am gonna say that I don't know a lot after the Torah, but I'm going to say this is one of my least favorite books. On the other hand, I really think we all should pat ourselves on the back and thank the rabbi, because I really didn't think we would have much to discuss in this book. And there really is a lot more to it. I think if I had read it myself, I would have skimmed through it.
Right. Well,
and not realizing all these nuances. There are nuances in this book. I appreciate it more. I'm not in love with it, you know, like I am with Torah.
So much of it is about war and about distribution of land that, you know, you kind of skim through it and certain things would be missing. But what's really important at the end is this covenant, which I'll talk about in a second. But Harvey wrote, in the Tao, they say the way that can be explained is not the true way, path. I see the same in terms of God. The God that can be explained is not the true God. All ideas by humans to explain it. Yeah, absolutely. This is our understanding of God. So first of all, I think this book is giving us the land of Canaan, the promised land, right? That even though we don't completely, just the way the Torah ends with us on the brink of entering the land, we still don't own the whole land. There still are a lot of issues to resolve. First of all, there are enemies that are still within the land, so-called enemies. And there's the fallibility of the people of Israel to boot, where it's not clear that they're going to be loyal. In fact, Joshua does not think so. And we've already seen them backsliding, and we're going to see them backsliding again. What we have at the end of this is a confederation of the tribes. So it's a loose confederation of different tribes that have come together and said, yes, we are faithful to God and we are connected to each other, but in a loose confederation. Okay, this is not a country, a nation, a kingdom, or anything yet. What we're going to get when we go into the book of Judges is each tribe has a judge. Now, it's called a judge, but a judge is also the ruler of that tribe, is also a judge, also a general in the army. I mean, it's a multiple function kind of position. And what's going to happen is that when a tribe is threatened, other tribes will come to help fight against that enemy. Not always all the tribes. Sometimes it's just one tribe fighting for itself. By the way, the tribe of Judah is like one of the last tribes to join this confederation, which is interesting because Judah is the last man standing and Judah writes the history. But some stuff gets left over that indicates what is really going on. As I mentioned before, some of the places that were destroyed still exist. Some of the people who were killed are still alive. So Joshua is a kind of idealized version of the conquest. Judges is more realistic. And the book of Judges is going to set us up for the book of Samuel. The book of Samuel is where we get the Davidic kingdom. David's not the first king, Saul is the first king, but then David, and then David's line is supposed to be ruling forever after. And it's setting it up as an explanation for why it is needed to have a nation united with a king. What do you think that reason would be? Even though, by the way, the book of Deuteronomy—
Don't they want order and peace?
Okay, the book of Deuteronomy says the only thing a king can do is write a Torah all day long, right? There's a real danger to having a king because there's only one real king. Who's that? Who's God. The real king? Did someone
God.
Say? God. God's the king. That's
God.
That's, you know, a human king is not, you know, going to take the place of God. You don't need a king. But the people are going to ask for a king. And so what, okay, why do they need to be unified under a king?
For battle, right?
Yes, because the Philistines are this constant threat. And the only way to defeat them, they're technologically more advanced than the Israelites. and they're a constant threat. And so you need to have a united kingdom in order to create an army and have a leader that can really defeat them. And what's going to happen in the book of Judges, it's kind of an interesting, you can almost compare it to the book of Exodus, because it is basically a whole new system here. You've got this confederation of tribes for the first time, right, in the land of Canaan. And at the beginning of any new order, guess what kind of people can be in power? Just like at the beginning of the book of Exodus, when there's a revolution going on and there's going to be an uprising of the slaves, new order. What people are able to be in power that are not later?
The soldiers. I mean, the generals.
Well, yeah, they're in power as far as, you know, being able to fight, but in terms of leadership, who are leaders that normally are not in power, who could be in power at the beginning of a revolution?
Well, they're the spokesman for the party in a revolution. Lenin was the spokesman for the Bolshevik Party.
Right. But if you think, okay, who are the important people at the beginning of Exodus? Who made it possible for the Exodus to actually happen in the very beginning?
You mean like the priestly class? Is that what you're getting at? Like Moses and Aaron and
How did Moses even survive?
But women, the women.
Thank you. Women. Okay, there were many women at the beginning of the book of Exodus who enabled this thing to even happen. Moses would have died if it hadn't been for the women. His mother kept him alive, even though she was supposed to toss him in the Nile. She did put him in the Nile, but in a basket. The princess took him out of the Nile. Miriam made sure that there was somebody, and by the way, the midwives, the midwives did kill them on sight, right?
Right.
What happens to the women after the first couple of chapters? Do you ever hear from them again? Almost not. And that's going to be the case with the judges. One of the first judges is Devorah. Bye, Harvey. One of the first judges is Devorah, a woman. Okay. And also people who generally would not be leaders, like there's a left-handed guy. Now that doesn't sound like anything radical, but yeah, in those days, left hand bad, right? We know that. You probably, were you forced, Sandy, when you were a kid to use your right hand to write?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, well, a lot of kids were in those days.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law made.
You know, the Latin word for left is sinister. Yes.
Exactly. What hand did you use to wipe yourself and so you couldn't shake hands with people? Right?
Right.
Okay.
And also in Muslim countries, like when we lived in Pakistan, you ate with your right hand and you wiped with your left hand.
Exactly.
And I was left-handed, and they said, "Can't you try to eat?"
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So you get a left-handed person. We toss women into these wonderful categories because, by the way, like in the Talmud, women can't be witnesses, neither can children or people who are deaf or, you know, or slaves. We're in that same category. So you have a woman who's a judge, you have a left-handed person, you have a bastard, all kinds of people who normally would not be in power. And of course, eventually you shift to the typical male ruler who's not left-handed, who's not a bastard. Okay, so that's one thing that's interesting to notice is the women in the beginning. And of course, what the rabbis do with Devorah, which we'll talk about when we get to her, is, oh, Devorah couldn't possibly be the general who defeated, you know, the enemy. It's actually the general named Barak. He's the one who did it. She just came along for the ride. Yeah, right. You also have Yael. We'll talk about Yael, who is a pretty powerful woman who does some pretty interesting things. If anyone knows the story. If you don't, you're in for a treat. But by the end of the book of Judges is a hideous, hideous, horrible story. It's probably the worst story in the Bible about a woman who is completely destroyed. So I actually wrote a paper about the women in the book of Judges. So I'm particularly keenly sensitive to this particular subject. The other thing that we'll see is it'll say over and over again, especially towards the end, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was according to their own, way or whatever. Setting the stage for why we need a king. And I think there are a lot of different voices in the Bible. So there are voices that are opposed to kingship, and there are voices that obviously are pro-kingship. Because with the judges, with this loose confederation, things don't go very well. Not that they go so well when there's a king either, but that's the next attempt at trying to find a way to organize society. So I don't know, it's 11:20. I don't know if we should start or if we should wait till next week to start the book of Judges. I think,
I think we should wait.
Yeah, I think it'll be too much to start, talking about right away. But there's a lot of really interesting stories in here. It's much more interesting than the Joshua, much more interesting. Okay, I think you'll enjoy it because there are some really good stories. They're not happy stories necessarily. And by the way, one of the stories in there is Samson and Delilah. And if anybody remembers, I did a whole class on women in the Bible, and Delilah is not the horrible woman she's made out to be. Even though in popular culture, she's used as the, ultimate seductress and witch. That's what they do to women. Okay, there's something in the chat. Let's see. Oh, I already read that. Okay, great.
Do we have another session coming up? You said
on the 20th. The 20th of March.
Okay, I was just looking at the last Adult Ed email that went out this week, and
it didn't say March 20th.
It didn't have any other Tanakh study the whole month.
You know what? Unfortunately, somebody else does that, not me. And I look it through, and sometimes I don't catch all the mistakes, and there are usually quite a few mistakes in there. So yes, definitely March 20th.
Okay.
It's sort of like somebody wrote the first one, and then other people edit it, and then the mistake gets carried through. So anyway, they didn't
I have it on my calendar. I have it on my calendar, so I know it came at one point.
It came in one of them.
It's the schedule of Adult Ed is has it in there. It's just that notice that goes out from the office.
Will it be taped because I have a baby shower that day?
Yes, I tape all these classes.
Okay.
And then let me just mention a few other things that are coming up. I mean, March is pretty full. So on the 18th, which is a Thursday evening, we're going to have a session about the Jews of Morocco, which I encourage people to come to because we tend to focus on the Ashkenazi Jews. So this is a whole other perspective that I think would be important. We're going to have a online Seder on the 28th, which is going to be preceded. So Howard Rubin has been doing meditation on Sunday afternoon. So he's going to do a special meditation session at 4 o'clock on March 28th. That's going to focus on Passover and the counting of the Omer, which are the days we count between Passover and Shavuot. April 8th is Yom HaShoah. So it's so funny. I have somebody coming on Zoom, Allison Owings, who wrote a book about German women during the Holocaust. And she wrote a book about it. And I had invited her last year. And last year, Yom HaShoah was right, like I think a month after the lockdown. And she offered to come online. I said, you know what, I'd rather have you in person. Let's wait till next year. So hello, here we are. So she's going to talk about that. We're going to have a service. And then over the weekend, we're going to show, or there's going to be a screening, but you have to sign up for it. You have to RSVP for a showing of the film Resistance. And it's a very interesting film. It's a movie. It's not a documentary, but it's the guy who's doing it is Jesse Eisenberg, playing Marcel Marceau. I don't know who knows Marcel Marceau.
Yeah.
You, Susie, of course, and Ruth. He was a mime, very famous French mime. And as a younger man, he helped save thousands of children during the Holocaust by bringing them over the mountains to Switzerland. And it's quite a good film. He didn't want me to say anything, but Mike Goldware is actually funding this screening. And it's going to be over the weekend after Yom HaShoah, the weekend of March 10th. The reason you have to RSVP, and I'm going to send out a new
April 10th, don't you?
April. Thank you. Yes, April 10th. Thank you. He is going to be over that weekend. You can watch it anytime you want. There is a link, but in order to get the password, you have to sign up. And I'm going to send out a new adult ed thing that has all that information in it. It's the guy who played James Bond in it. Who's the guy who played James Bond? I don't know who that is.
Sean Connery.
Somebody was asked that.
Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig.
I don't think
Must
Daniel
be more
Craig
recent.
No. Anyway, so yeah, Mike Goldware is funding it, and I don't know, Victoria, who else is in it. I don't think it's anybody.
Daniel Craig is the recent Bond. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he's in it. Jesse Eisenberg's the guy who played Zuckerberg in the film about Facebook.
Rabbi, Jews in Morocco on the 18th. What time?
7 p.m. 7 p.m. I'm gonna send out a new adult ed schedule, because it's got all those new links in it and all that new information. I was waiting. I don't know why I was waiting, but I waited. Okay. So don't believe everything you read in those MailChimp updates, because I don't do them. I just review them and I don't always catch everything. And
when do you need to register, Rabbi?
As soon as
you said you need to register for the film.
Yes, I'm going to send you the link. Yes, I'm going to send you the link. I will do that actually right after we're done with this class. I'll send you the link. I'm going to send you the new schedule of adult ed. It's got all that information in it.
Thank you.
So it's being shown in honor of a number of Holocaust survivors or people who helped save people. So I do recommend watching it. And I'm sure there's more going on. Oh yeah, this Sunday, March 7th at 10 a.m. is the second in our series about aging. The first one had Laura Geller. I don't know, were some of you on that? Rabbi Laura Geller? Yeah.
It was excellent.
Yeah, she's great. And this one is going to be Rabbi Doug Cohn, who some of you know, who was in San Bernardino and is now in New York State. And he's going to talk about Alzheimer's primarily, and he'll talk a little bit about cancer and other things in, older people. The final one will be April 11th with Rabbi Richie Address. So those are the three aging sessions. And then, yes, March 20th is our next Torah study. There are a couple in April, and then I have to look at May and pick out some dates in May. Okay, any questions before we end?
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Ruth?
I think you're working harder now
than you did when we saw you in person.